Okay, can you guys hear me? All right. All right, finish your conversations and we will jump into it. So, we're halfway through the material, we're almost halfway through the material that will be for test number 1. So I'm just going to quickly review what I ended with last time, which is the difference between individualistic cultures and collectivistic cultures. Again, just to be brief, in individualistic cultures, individual uniqueness is emphasized. The goal is to strive to achieve your unique potential. That's what's sort of emphasized and valued in the culture. By contrast, in collectivistic cultures, living up to your family or your group's expectations is what is valued. And we did that little task where you had to write down a set of I am statements. And what has been found is that people in collectivistic cultures will write more relational I am statements. So I am a sibling, I am a friend, I am an employee, whereas people in individualistic cultures will have more self terms just about you. I am happy, I am intelligent, or what have you. So that's one example of the kind of thing that sociocultural psychologists might study. Okay, so we will now move on to the biological perspective. There are a few different approaches that fall under this general umbrella, and the first is neuroscience, right? Cognitive and behavioral neuroscience. I won't spend too much time here because there's going to be a whole chapter just on this. The basic method is pretty easy to understand. What you do is you scan people's brains while they are doing various psychological tasks. You put someone in an fMRI machine, you have them do a math problem, and you see which parts of the brain light up. Right? Pretty easy to understand. And as I say, we'll be spending a whole chapter on the different findings that have been made under that umbrella. A biological perspective that requires a bit more explaining is something called behavior or behavioral genetics. We will be spending half a chapter on this perspective, and namely the first half of chapter 4. Behavioral geneticists are interested in the nature versus nurture debate. So I've mentioned this already. So the nature versus nurture debate is about where human differences come from. So as you may have noticed from being alive, people are different. Right? Some people are happier than other people. Some people are funnier than other people. Some people are smarter than other people, and so on. And the nature versus nurture debate is about why people are different. If you're on the nature side, then you think it's because of genetics. People are born with different genetic predispositions, and that's what explains why people are different. If you're on the nurture side, you think it's because of upbringing and culture. People are just kind of raised differently. Culture is less relevant, actually, to at least to individual differences. But something in the environment is what explains why people are different. And the behavior geneticists have several different methods for estimating the relative contribution of genetics. We won't talk about all of them right now. As I say, there's a half chapter on this, but I'm going to talk about a kind of family of methods that are good to know, and the basics of these methods are testable. And that's twin studies. Very prolific area in behavior genetics. twin studies monopolize on some basic facts about twins. The first is there are two kinds of twins. Identical or monozygotic twins. And fraternal. Fraternal means like sibling or brother. As we'll see, fraternal twins are as genetically similar as ordinary siblings. I'll explain that in a second. But fraternal or dizygotic twins. So here's the basic. By the way, zygote. Does anyone know what a zygote is? Someone say. Shout it out. Right before the embryo, right? So it's a fertilized egg. Sperm hits an egg. That thing is a zygote. So mono means one, di means two. So identical twins or monozygotic twins come from one zygote. So sperm hits an egg, it splits into two people. Therefore, they have identical DNA. They share 100% of their genes. They're basically clones. By contrast, dizygotic twins only share half of their genes. They are as genetically related as ordinary siblings. So it's two zygotes, two eggs, two sperm. So basically they're just siblings who share a womb. So how does this help us with the nature and nurture debate? I'm going to discuss two methods. The first method is probably the easier one to understand. Researchers have looked at identical twins who are raised in separate families. So there's a couple of these studies, I think 2 or 3, and with a few hundred twins in each study. So these are twins who were separated at birth and adopted into different families. If genes played no role in psychological traits, then these twins should not be similar at all, right? Because they have no familial upbringing in common. But in fact, for virtually every trait that you can measure, identical twins raised apart are highly similar. Not 100% similar, but highly similar. So for IQ, for personality, even for political beliefs, there's a little effect of genes. Identical twins are remarkably similar. So that's one method of estimating the relative contribution of genes to a given trait. Another method is to forget about adoption, forget about twins that are raised in separate families, and just look at twins who are raised in the same family. You can get much bigger samples this way because most twins, of course, are not adopted. And what you can do is compare these twins to these twins. So you get a big sample, like 1,000 identical twins and 1,000 fraternal twins, and you look at what's the degree of correlation for these twins compared to these twins. If genes play a role in a trait, then these twins should be more similar than these twins. They both share all of their home environment, but these ones have the bonus of also sharing twice as many genes. And again, for virtually every trait, these twins are more similar than these twins. I won't go into all the details of how similar for which trait. We're going to look at that in chapter 4. But that's just to help you understand the kind of method that behavior geneticists use. Any questions about this? Yes?
Is this determinism?
Good question. No. So, well, a determinist could use this kind of evidence, I suppose, but the influence of genes on traits is never deterministic. It's never like 100% determinative. Genes exert an influence on traits, but not deterministically. But there's a kind of connection in that, yes, there's certainly genes exert a causal influence, and it might be a problem for someone who believes in maybe magical free will. Any other questions? Yes?
Do you think that the fact that like the parents that are able to adopt children
that
Yes.
means very poor families not be able to adopt children, right?
Yes,
They're raised in like separate, like.
This is a criticism that has been put forward against the adoption method. The types of families that tend to be able to adopt are higher socioeconomic status, right? They tend not to let poorer families adopt. That could lead to an overestimation of the extent to which genes play a role, because both kids who are adopted have at least a kind of minimally decent standard of living. That criticism wouldn't apply to the other twin method, where you compare the similarity of identical and fraternal twins. But yes, that is one problem with the adoption method. Yes?
So when considering like how much it determines of them, could it be that the genes determine how like the intake and reception of information to a large degree?
Yeah, that's one argument. It's hard to know, as we'll talk about in chapter 4, it's hard to know exactly what the mechanism is by which genes exert an influence, and in most cases we just don't know. We do know, I would say with a very large degree of confidence, that genes exert an influence on traits like personality, IQ, etc., but we don't know exactly how. It could be something like what you said, but the truth is, we just don't know. I'm just going to turn this. Okay, any other questions? Your hand's up first, yes?
So what the twins, like the identical twins that were raised with their like original families, we kind of treat as a control variable. It's just like the other student mentioned, there were issues with like socio-economic.
Yeah, you could view the fraternal twins raised together as a kind of control condition, because they also share all the home environment, and then the identical twins have the bonus of sharing extra genes as well. Okay, last question. I think you had your hand up. I would say yes. Have a sense of how both methods work. Yeah. Like I said, I haven't taught you any details of the findings. Just know kind of the logic. So, identical twins raised apart, if they are still similar, that suggests that there's a genetic contribution to the trait. And similarly, if these twins are more similar than these twins when raised together, that also suggests that there's a genetic contribution to the trait. Okay, let's move on to the last perspective in the chapter, which is evolutionary psychology. So evolutionary psychology is probably the most controversial perspective in the chapter. There are two sources of controversy. One quite obvious one is some religious people object to evolution on religious grounds. I was raised in such a family. I was raised to think that evolution was a pile of garbage. Later I gave that up, of course. Funny story about that. I once was in a monkey cage, like kind of a petting zoo situation. There's little cute monkeys, we were all playing with the monkeys and so on. And I was holding a monkey, and I touched its foot. Okay, leave your phones on silent. But I touched the monkey's foot, and I remember thinking, that feels exactly like my foot. So it's a little bit of an eye-opener. And over time, I came to learn the science more and came to accept evolutionary theory. I believe I noted in passing in another class that Darwin himself did not believe that there was any contradiction between his theory and religious faith, but this is not a philosophy of religion class, so we won't be getting into that. Another source of controversy that may surprise you, many on the secular left also object to evolution, but on somewhat different grounds. Evolutionary psychology tends to put forward biological explanations of human behavior, in particular, sex differences. Differences between men and women in behavior, and many on the secular left view that as being in conflict with their vision of human nature and human possibility. And I'll just note, if any of you object on any grounds to evolutionary psychology, this is not a class to get you to believe things. You can believe whatever you want. All I will be asking is that you understand the evolutionary psychology perspective. Just like look, I don't believe in the behaviorist perspective, but but I still have to understand what it is. The same is true, and I certainly don't believe in the Freudian perspective. Well, he had a little bit of insight, but as I said, a lot of it is crazy. And you are free to believe that evolutionary psychology is crazy too. All that you're required to do is understand how the paradigm works. I'll note as a point of interest, because chapter 1, as you may have noticed, has a lot of dead white males. In the case of evolutionary psychology, it was actually started by a power couple. I have no idea why, but in Ev Psych, there's a lot of couples that write papers together. It could be because in graduate school, a lot of Ev Psych is about human sexuality, so everyone's always thinking about that, and then they wind up getting married. I have no idea if that's why, but Lena Cosmides and John Tooby, who are mentioned in the book, are the ones who founded the modern incarnation of evolutionary psychology. And before I explain Ev Psych, I'll explain a little bit about natural selection and how evolution works. This may be review for many of you, but there's a lot of misunderstanding about how evolution works, so I'm going to explain a bit about that. And I'm going to start with a simple example. Suppose there's a bear, and I'm very bad at drawing, but there's a bear that has black fur. Don't laugh, you'll hurt my feelings. I know my limits. So suppose there's a funny story about that actually. I was in history honors in grade 12, and we had an assignment that involved coloring in a map. It was World War I, and we had to color in like the two teams. And I think I colored in Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary red, and the rest blue. And as you can guess, it was not very well colored in. But then I read the instructions, and I had to color in the ocean blue too. It was too late to go back. So it looked like Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary were an island. And so I got 4 out of 10. I was in history honors in grade 12. I got 4 out of 10 on color in the map. So art was never something that was in the cards for me. But let's suppose that the bear has 2 cubs. One has white fur, so just nothing there, and the other has red fur. So each cub has a mutation, right? A mutation is a random genetic change, right? So a gene changes through copying error, gets duplicated, whatever. Some accidental genetic copying error occurs. So this one has a genetic change that makes it have white fur, and this one has red fur. So what's going to happen? Well, given that the bear has moved to Siberia, where it's covered in snow, this bear is going to live longer, right? It's not going to be seen by prey. It's going to have more food. He's going to have more time to have fun with the female bears, and then he will have more kids. This one will have fewer kids. Go forward a few hundred generations, all of the bears in Siberia are going to have this gene. It's going to outcompete the red fur gene. Note, the red fur gene and the white fur gene do not need to be designed or caused for any purpose. That's just random luck. Red gene, white gene, whatever, right? But the process by which this gene becomes more prevalent in the population, that's natural selection. There's a good pithy definition of natural selection that you should know. Natural selection means genes which confer a benefit on the organism increase in frequency over time. That's it. That's really what it boils down to. And it's almost true by definition, especially, and to be more specific, it's that confer a reproductive advantage, right? An advantage that translates into more descendants. And when you think about it, it's like, well, yeah, a trait that makes you better at reproducing is going to get reproduced more. Almost true by definition. Okay, so that's evolution. That's how evolution works. Now, what does this have to do with psychology? Well, we are evolved animals, and evolutionary psychologists seek to explain various psychological traits that we have in terms of how they evolve. Here's one example that I suspect even critics of evolutionary psychology would be sympathetic to. Why does sugar taste good? It's not good for us, at least not in the modern environment. Why does it taste good? Good, yeah, so because of the effect it has on our brain. It's not intrinsically sweet, right? Our brain has a kind of instinctive preference for it. But then, so that's part of the answer. The evolutionary question would be, though, why are our brains built to prefer sugar? And, yes? Gives energy. It's high energy. It's higher calorie than most other things. Fat is the same way. Sugar and fat are both high energy. And so organisms which had a preference for sugar were more likely to survive and reproduce because we evolved in a context of scarcity, in which there was not a lot of food. And if you have a kind of genetic instinctive preference for high energy food, you're going to live longer than the ones that don't. So that's a kind of evolutionary explanation of a trait. Another example is physical attractiveness, the kinds of things we find attractive. Culture certainly exerts some influence here. There's cultural variability in what different people find attractive, but there are also some cultural universals. One that you may have heard of is bilateral symmetry, right? The extent to which one half of the face is the same as the other half of the face, that appears to be attractive in all the world's cultures. And why is that attractive? The standard F-psych explanation is that symmetry is an indicator of genetic health, right? The absence of harmful mutations. And an instinctive genetic preference for symmetrical faces would have been selected for because people who had that preference left more descendants than those who did not have the preference. I'll note in passing, that preference is so deep in our evolutionary history, even insects have it. Insects prefer to mate with other insects that are symmetrical. Yes?
This is a little bit out there, but do you know anything about like the psychology of kinks?
It's funny. Evolutionary psychology is typically concerned with human universals, so the kinds of traits that humans all have in common. Things like kinks are almost by definition difficult to analyze in evolutionary terms because they're unique to specific people, right? People have their own, you're all thinking of different things right now. Whatever weird thing you're thinking about, it's almost by definition idiosyncratic and therefore difficult to analyze with an evolutionary lens. We talk more about kinks and stuff like that in the chapter on abnormal psychology. That's in 105. But that's all I'll say about that right now. Any other questions? No questions. Okay. So as I say, we'll be spending a long time on that in chapter 4. The book mentions the term sociobiology. Don't worry about that term. What it is it's a historical precursor to evolutionary psychology. It was developed by a very important biologist named E.O. Wilson. The section on sociobiology is good to read. It has some interesting information. But the term, don't worry about it. It's basically older evolutionary psychology. Okay. One perspective that the book doesn't mention, but it's one that a lot of psychologists today implicitly accept, is the biopsychosocial perspective. I'm not going to test you on this, but it's a good term to know. You can kind of guess what it means, right? So it's a perspective that integrates a biological perspective, a psychological perspective, and a socio-cultural one. All perspectives of having some relevance. And the lines between these different perspectives gets fuzzy, and this perspective emphasizes that. I'll give an example of a really cool study that integrates the different perspectives. There was a study of men from the northern United States and men from the southern United States. So, if any of you have been to both parts of the US, you'll know that they are profoundly culturally different. I actually lived in Georgia for about a year. I did my master's at Georgia State University, which is kind of deep in the South. The South is sort of more conservative, more religious, more old-fashioned, and they have more of what cultural psychologists call a culture of honor. Meaning, if your honor is slighted, someone insults you or does something else that is bad for your honor, you are sort of culturally obligated to retaliate, to defend your honor. Whereas in the North, it's more about dignity. If you're insulted, the manly thing to do is keep a stiff upper lip and sort of not let it affect you. Canada's more like that too, most of the time. And there was a study where they compared how men in the North and men in the South responded to insults. So they had people come into the lab and walk from the waiting room to the lab room. And a man would walk down the hall and accidentally bump into the guy and say, "Hey, watch where you're going, asshole." And it was made to seem like it was totally spontaneous and real. In fact, the guy who bumped into them was working for the experimenter, but it was made so that it didn't look like that. And what they found was men in the South, their testosterone went up after this happened. Men in the North, no effect. So is that biological or is it cultural? Well, it's not genetic. It's not like there's a genetic difference between northern men and southern men, but it shows that the culture you grow up in can even shape the way in which your biology reacts. So that's one example of kind of integrating the different perspectives. As an aside, there's a kind of cool historical explanation for why some cultures become more honor-based. There's a lot of evidence that cultures that started out as more herding cultures, like animals, instead of farming, tend to become cultures of honor. And the hypothesis is it's because you need to maintain a reputation for violence if you have animals. If you're a goat herder or something, like my people in Scotland would have been, one guy can steal all your shit in one night. You got like a dozen goats, your livelihood's gone in one night. So you have to maintain a reputation for violence. That's one cultural explanation. You don't need to know that, that's just, that was for free. Okay, so that is the end of chapter 1. Chapter 1 also includes a discussion of different career paths you can take in psychology and different specialties you can have. Don't worry about that. I'm not going to test you on that. If you're interested in going on in psychology, it's worth reading, but no test questions on that. So we'll now move on to chapter 2. And we're going to start with a little activity. So please, on your computer or on a piece of paper, I want you to write down 2 numbers. 1 for how many sports you have played in since grade 9, outside of PE class. And martial arts, gymnastics, stuff like that would all count. And how extroverted you are on a scale of, let's say, 1 to 10. So 2 numbers. How many sports you've played since grade 9, and how extroverted you are on a scale of 1 to 10. I won't ask you for the number, but it's just to get you thinking about my example. 2 numbers.
Does esports count?
Does esports count? I'm going to say no. Some sort of physical sport.
What are you talking about, team sports or individual sports?
Say that.
Individual sports, I think, would count. Yes. And like I said, I'm not going to ask. It doesn't matter too much, but yes. Sorry? It can be an individual sport too. It actually won't matter too much. Like I said, I'm not going to actually publish these results or anything. It's just to get you thinking. Okay. You don't need to tell your neighbor how many sports you played. It doesn't matter. Okay. So, all right. End your conversations. So, I'm going to use this to introduce a concept that occurs later in the chapter, but it's so fundamental that I want to start off with it. So, he's taking something from the middle of the chapter and putting it at the beginning. Maybe it'll be on the test. Okay, so let's say I collected all your data, and when I had smaller classes I would, but I don't feel like having you all come up and tell me, so I'll just imagine that I asked you. So let's say sports range from 1 to 10. Maybe some of you had more, but we'll just suppose. And let's say extroversion ranges from 1 to 10. Well, actually, I made it range from 1 to 10. So this is what we call a scatter plot. We can locate people in a 2-dimensional space. We can locate them on how many sports they played and how extroverted they are. So let's say someone played a lot of sports but was not very extroverted. They might go like here. Maybe they're like a 4 or a 3, and they're like a 9 here. Well, we can put a bunch of people on here, right? Bunch of data. I'm actually going to erase this person so it looks more clear. Now, if we found something like this, this would be an example of a positive correlation. So correlation is a very important word to know in psychology. Correlation means that the variables change together or vary together. So in this case, the more sports you play, the more extroverted you tend to be. I have no idea if that's true or not. I just made this data up, obviously, but let's just suppose the class looked like this. So the higher you are in the sports, the more extroverted you tend to be. And it's positive because as one variable increases, the other tends to increase too. Right? They increase together, you could say. Now, suppose we did, and I would guess this is true, although I don't know for sure, suppose we did video games and found the opposite pattern. Again, I have no idea if this is true or not, I'm just making this up. This would be and by the way, the correlations in psychology are almost never that strong. It's usually a lot more scattered, but I'm just making it strong so it's easier to see the pattern. That would be a negative correlation. Which means as one variable increases, the other tends to decrease. Now later in the chapter, I'll talk about how to attach numbers to these. As a little spoiler, they range from -1 to +1, where, +1 would be like this. That would be like a perfect, positive correlation. They're completely in sync, which you will never see, especially not in psychology. But I won't go into that detail now. Instead, I'm just going to deal with this example. So let's say we found this correlation between sports and extroversion. Okay, found a positive correlation like this. It would be very tempting to look at this correlation and make the following conclusion. Playing sports causes you to be extroverted. Very tempting. And then, my kid's not very extroverted. I should make him play sports. That will cause him to be more extroverted. Some of you have a look on your face, which is good. That is bad reasoning. In my opinion, this is the single most important thing that you can learn from a psychology class. It applies to all the sciences, and it is the first thing that science students and psychology students seem to forget. In popular science articles, people make this mistake all the time. So, I should say, the most important thing that you can learn from a psychology class is correlation. I hear some of you whispering it. It does not imply causation. Absolutely fundamental. The mere fact that two variables are correlated, meaning they vary together, that does not mean that one of them causes the other. And the reason is, whenever you have a correlation like this, there are three possibilities. One, A causes B. Like whenever A and B are correlated. So in this case, sports causes extroversion. Now, that's possible. That's one of the possibilities. It's not crazy to think maybe sports causes extroversion, or playing sports causes extroversion. But it is also possible that B causes A. Maybe people who are more extroverted play more sports. Maybe it's their extroversion that causes them to get into more sports because they like people. They want to do more people activities. And lastly, it's possible that C, some unknown variable or set of variables that you didn't measure, causes both A and B. So for example, maybe height. Maybe tall people are more extroverted. Right? When you're taller, you're more confident and you talk to more people. I'm just making this up. I have no idea if that's true, but it's possible. And maybe tall people also play more sports. Yeah. And the point is, you have no way of knowing if that's true or not just based on the correlation. You don't know which of these is true. So to jump from the correlation to number one is invalid. You cannot infer that. Now that's kind of depressing because we want to know about causation, right? Knowing about cause and effect is scientifically very interesting, and of course, it's also relevant to intervention. Part of the reason we do science is we want to know which interventions will work and not work. And to know that, you have to know about cause and effect. This is where experiments come into it. So I think in the PowerPoint notes I call experiments psychology's secret weapon. That's a good way to think about it. We love experiments. We think experiments are the way to go at least when you can do them. And here are the basic steps of an experiment. You get a sample of people, 100 people or whatever, and then crucial step, you randomly assign them to two conditions. Okay? And then one of the groups you do something to, and you don't do it, or at least you do less of it, to the other group. So in this case, we get a group of kids and we have one of them play sports, let's say 5 sports for a year, and the other group we have them play 0 sports for a year. The thing that you change or manipulate between the two groups, does anyone know the name for that? Starts with an I? Someone said it. The independent variable, exactly. So the independent variable is the variable that you manipulate or control. So how many sports you make them play, that would be the independent variable here. And then you bring them back in a year and you measure their extroversion. So the variable that you measure at the end, that is the dependent variable. The reason it's called that is if it's an effect of the independent variable, well, it depends on it, right? Because your hypothesis is that sports increases extroversion. That means extroversion depends on how many sports you play. So it's called the dependent variable. Now, if at the end of this study, the sports group is more extroverted, significantly more extroverted than the no sports group, now you have very good evidence that playing sports causes you to be more extroverted. And the crucial reason for that is this step. This step is the most important step. Random assignment. When you randomly assign people to the two conditions, you're making it so that these groups are basically the same. They should have roughly the same number of tall people, happy people, people who like reading manga or whatever. They should be basically the same. So the only thing left that's different between them is the thing that you control, right? How many sports they play. So whatever differences result in their level of extroversion, you can infer that it's because of the manipulation, how many sports they play. So random assignment is therefore the key step. Any questions about this? Okay. We will be returning to this in the middle of the chapter, but I thought I'd start off with it because, as I say, it's very important. Okay. So now let's go in order. We'll start from the beginning of chapter 2. And chapter 2 starts off with scientific attitudes. And this might seem like a strange place to start, like attitudes. Isn't that kind of subjective or a weird kind of thing to emphasize? But I think scientific attitudes are very important. There are a number of attitudes that scientific training drums into you. And the three that the book lists are curiosity, skepticism, and open-mindedness. Curiosity is that itch to understand. You want to know why things are the way they are, including things that seem obvious, things that seem like they have no need of explanation. There's a famous story about Newton. Apparently it's probably not true, but there's this story about Newton that he was sitting under an apple tree and he saw an apple fall from the tree and wondered, why does it fall down instead of up? And whether or not that happened, it's very emblematic of how a scientist thinks. Right? Many people could say, why do you care? Well, of course apples fall down. Why would you ask such a stupid question? But of course, asking that question was very fruitful in physics. Similarly, we will be asking questions about humans that might seem kind of obvious. Why do we use language? Why do we like sugar? Why do we fall in love? And you might say, well, that's dumb. Why would you ask something like that? But you need to have that curiosity, that itch to understand why things are the way they are. Another important one is skepticism. One of the first scientific societies in the world, the Royal Society in the UK, had a saying, kind of a mantra, nullius in verba, which is Latin for take no one's word for it. Take no one's word for it. in science, as I kind of talked about in chapter 1, we're always trying to disprove things, trying to question things, never taking it on faith, right? Demanding evidence, having the attitude of, show me. Don't just tell me, but show me that what you're saying is true. And lastly, open-mindedness. You're willing to have your beliefs changed. You don't stick dogmatically to your favorite theory or your favorite perspective. You're willing to have it challenged and revised. You're open to being proven wrong. To highlight a few of these, I have a video clip from Sean Carroll. We had a video from him in chapter 1, but he talks about some of these quite well. But yeah, so he mentioned empiricism, which we talked about in the last chapter, right? The emphasis on looking at the world and not just thinking about it, and what a similar point to the one I made about skepticism. Okay. The book then, if you're on page 39, gives a kind of standard account of the steps in the scientific process. Oh, yes, sir.
Would doing research based on skepticism be categorized as basic or applied research?
Both. I would say that, again, these are attitudes. They're sort of attitudes that you should have. And I would say a good scientist should have them when they're in basic or in applied research. Now, these are ideals. In practice, scientists are human beings. Scientists often have kind of bias for their own theory, but ideally we should be striving to be more skeptical, regardless of the type of research that you're doing. So the book has a discussion of the sort of 5 steps of science. These are good to know. It's a pretty standard account, so as I say, maybe largely review. And it uses as an example to illustrate how this works, the murder of Kitty Genovese. This is a famous tragedy in the United States, which you don't need to know, it's just an illustration. Kitty Genovese was brutally murdered in front of apartments in New York City, and for, I forget how long, like 30, 40 minutes, no one did anything. Not even call 911 while she was screaming for help and being repeatedly stabbed. Now that's kind of puzzling, right? We like to think that we're a good species in most ways, but why did no one call 911? Are New York citizens just evil? Maybe. I saw a hand. Yes?
No one called 911 because of bystander syndrome, that they thought someone else would probably call 911.
Perfect. You spoiled it, but yes. I saw another hand, though. All right. So step 1, she skipped step 5, but step 1 is to identify a question of interest. So just have a question. In this case, why did people in New York not intervene? Step 2 is to form a hypothesis, which, as we saw in the previous chapter, is a guess. You make something up. You take a guess as to what the cause is. So the hypothesis that was formed is what this person said, which is it's because of how many bystanders there were. They guessed that maybe it's because in New York there's a lot of people, and when there's more people, they think, someone else will take care of it. So that's the hypothesis. And then you have to test your hypothesis. So step 3 is test your guess. So they did, Latani and Darley did a series of experiments where they would put people in emergency situations. Like they'd have them waiting in the waiting room, and they'd have smoke come in, or someone having a seizure, or some other emergency. Of course, it wasn't real, but it was realistic enough to fool people into thinking it was real. And then you put people in different conditions. You randomly assign people to conditions where there's only 1 person in the room, where there's 3, and where there's 10, I think is what they did. But whatever the exact number is, you vary how many people are in the room. If the bystander hypothesis is right, then people should be slower and less likely to help in the conditions with more people. And that's what happened. In the conditions with 10 people, people were much slower to react, if at all. So you test the hypothesis, and step 4, I sort of already said, you analyze the data that comes from your test, and you form a tentative conclusion. You're like, all right, the evidence from this study seems to indicate that number of people decreases your chances of helping. And then step 5 is you try to, over time, build a theory. Build a kind of body of data and a body of ideas. You don't want to just do one study. You want to test it a few different times with different types of manipulations, and you want to kind of put together a body of knowledge. So pretty standard account of how science works with a little example. And as I said in chapter 1, a crucial ingredient of scientific ideas is to make predictions. And chapter 2 contrasts this with hindsight. It is always easy to explain things in hindsight. But in science, we want to make predictions in advance. In particular, there's actually something called hindsight bias, which is sometimes called the "I knew it all along" phenomenon. We have a tendency when we learn something to tell ourselves, "Hey, that's obvious. Oh, I already knew that." And part of the reason I did that little game show thing with the 6 statements, some of which were true and some of which were false, is to hopefully disabuse you of hindsight bias. In this book, we will be learning many things about psychology. And it's going to be very tempting to say, "Oh, yeah, that's obvious. I already knew that." But the reason I did that activity where I had you all guess is to show you that when you have to guess in advance whether something is true, it's a lot harder than just explaining it in hindsight. Okay. So one thing I forgot to say, it's important to keep in mind, and this is these are 2 key terms, keep in mind the difference between a hypothesis and a theory. The line can sometimes get fuzzy, but the general idea is that a hypothesis is a specific testable statement. So, if I increase the number of people in the room, people will be less likely to help in an emergency. That's a hypothesis. It's a specific testable guess that you have made. A theory, you could maybe think of as a network of hypotheses, but what it is it's a network of ideas and statements that explain a wide range of data. So something like Newtonian theory, it's not just one statement, it's a set of laws that are logically related that explain a large body of data. Evolutionary theory would be another example. Again, the line can be fuzzy, but in general, that's the difference. Now, psychology has a special problem that other sciences and other theories don't have, at least not as badly as we have it. And that is that the variables that we study are sort of difficult to define. In science, it's very important that variables be well defined and precise. But in psychology, we're interested in things like intelligence, anxiety, happiness, and these are sort of difficult to define. Right? A little task you do is go home and try to write down a 1-sentence definition of intelligence that doesn't use synonyms like smart or something like that. You'll discover that it's actually quite hard. And psychologists still disagree about how exactly to define it. But we have this problem that in science, things have to be well defined. So our solution is to give operational definitions. Very important term. So when we do a study and we measure certain variables, an important step is to give an operational definition. So let's say, a common example is intelligence. Let's say you're interested in intelligence. As I say, intelligence is kind of hard to define, but what you would typically do in a psychology study is you would say, okay, in this study, when I say intelligence, what I really mean is IQ score. Even though I know that IQ tests are not perfect, they may not capture everything that we mean by intelligence, but we have to be precise, so we're going to operationalize intelligence as meaning IQ score. And that's a good definition, or a good operational definition, because it's precise and measurable. So an operational definition is when you define something in a precise, measurable way. You define it in terms of how it's measured. So just to give another example, suppose you're interested in happiness. What is happiness? You know, philosophers have argued about that a lot, and you could argue about it too, but if you're doing a psychology study, probably what you will do is give like a questionnaire. You know, how happy are you? How often do you feel joy? You know, do you wake up in the morning ready to start the day? Whatever. And you get a total score, and you say, okay, in this study, when I say happiness, I mean your score on this questionnaire. Because that's precise and measurable. Any questions about that? Not all at once. Okay. Now, there are different ways of measuring variables in psychology. The examples that I've been giving relate to self-report, right? Many studies in psychology use self-report measures. This is the easiest way to measure something. If you want to know how happy someone is, how extroverted they are, whatever, you just ask them, how happy are you? How extroverted are you? There's a few problems with this. Can anyone think of some obvious ones? Very quick hand, yes. Humans tend to lie. Some of you may have noticed this. Yes, humans tend to lie. I saw your hand up next.
An ability to like self-recognize.
Exactly. People may not be able to introspectively access what their attitudes actually are. Yes.
Humans are greedy.
Humans are greedy. Kind of relates to the lying one. Okay, one more. Yes, sir.
Emotions fluctuate over at different times. So you might ask someone at one point, they might say one answer and then another. If they're
Yep.
down or
So yeah, unreliable. They might change over time. That's probably good enough. Yes. So lying, misrepresenting, or not having a good, accurate, introspective access to what your psychological traits actually are. One particular type of lying or misleading that you should know is the social desirability bias. Which is the bias towards giving answers that you think will be socially desirable. So you tend to, yes?
Sorry, I'm interrupting. But like, is it kind of based on like shame and stuff? The social desirability. So if I were to be a subject in happiness study, whatever, right? And I, for some reason, at the end of the study, I said that I wasn't as happy. I would lie and say that I was because of the shame of being like unhappy with this and everything.
Yeah, shame could be a variable. It doesn't have to be shame. So it's a bias towards any type of answering that makes you more desirable. So it could be because it's less shameful or because it makes you look cooler. It doesn't need to be shame, but any way in which you bend your answers to make yourself look better, that would be social desirability bias. So this is a difficult problem to control. And there are some ways of getting around it. One method that I'll briefly mention Some studies will include like lie detectors, not like the physical one, but they'll include questions that are essentially lie detecting questions. Yes, sir?
If you do a test with just an exorbitantly large sample size, do you trust the results more or less considering social desirability bias?
I would say that the issue of sample size is independent of social desirability bias. Having a large sample is better than a small sample, but it wouldn't really help or harm the social desirability bias. Good question. So, but with the lie detector questions, what you do is you include a few questions where the socially desirable answer is true of almost no one. So for example, you ask, have you ever missed a day of flossing? Okay, almost no, maybe there's one person in the world, but almost no one is it true they've never missed a day of flossing. Now maybe you're special in that one way. Okay, you include another question. Have you ever done anything you feel guilty about? Again, if you say no, and you give like 5 questions like that, if they say the socially desirable thing to all of them, cut that person out of the study. They're not telling the truth. So there's little workarounds like that, but in general, this is a big problem. It's a big problem actually in my own research. So I do moral psychology, right? I study how people react to moral dilemmas. But what I'm really studying is how they react to moral dilemmas on a computer screen. People may say, oh yeah, I believe that's right. I would do that sort of thing. But in the real world, they might not. Okay. Another way, which gets around the social desirability problem, is to use behavioral measures. Right? Measure how people behave. So suppose you're interested in childhood aggressive behavior. You could do an aggression scale, or you could just measure how many fights they get into. And that kind of solves that problem. Right? So you can measure direct behavior. And lastly, you could use physiological measures. So measure their brain activity, measure their galvanic skin response, their heart rate. And of course, in psychology, the main one that we're interested in is brain activity, but there are others too. So all of these are good measures to use. And just as an example, I'm going to show a video that combined the latter two. This was actually one of my supervisors at Georgia State University. Did a really cool study about using the brain to predict behavior. But yes, sir.
For a behavioral study, how do you get around the fact that people would behave differently when they know they're being studied?
Yeah, that's another problem. I think it's called the Hawthorne effect. Yes, people do behave differently when they're being studied. So one solution, of course, is to just observe people unobtrusively. So in a context where it's public and you don't let them know that you're watching them. And there are contexts where psychologists are allowed to do that. That has its own problems, but that's one workaround. Any other questions before the video? Okay, hopefully the audio is better with this one. So as I say, this is an example of a study that combines the bottom two. So a very interesting study. He goes on to discuss some of the potential ethical problems with this, as I'm sure many of you were thinking about. And that's a difficult question that's beyond the scope of this class. But it's an interesting example of a cutting-edge method that is being used that applies both physiological and behavioral measures. And for whatever it's worth, here at the U of A, my own supervisor, Kyle Nash, emphasizes the importance of using all 3 of those methods: self-report, behavior, and neuroscience or some other physiological measure. Okay, I'm going to do something now that may make some of you unhappy. I'm going to add a turn to the book. I'm devastated. So the book talks about the importance of having reliable measures. This applies especially in the case of self-report. Or we could just say the importance of, I'm just going to say reliability. But I'm going to add the term validity. If you take any further courses in psychology, you will thank me, because these are almost always paired together. Now, in the key terms, you'll see that I say validity of a measurement, because later in the chapter, there's a different sense of the word validity. And again, you may be angry that I'm adding another term that's the same, but if you take 105 or really any psychology classes, you will thank me. So here's the basic idea. These are two features that we want a psychological measurement to have. Reliability means that the measurement is consistent. So someone asked about reports changing over time. To the extent that a test is consistent, it tends not to change over time. But here's an example. Suppose I make a new IQ test. It's not my area, but suppose I changed fields and I decide I want to make a new IQ test. And I give it to Susan on Monday, and she has an IQ of 135 on my test. And then I give it to her on Friday, and she gets a 62. That's not a very good test, right? If it's changing like that all the time, that's an indication that it's not very reliable. However, we don't just want that, because it's possible for a test to be reliable and a piece of trash. So suppose I make the new IQ test, and here's how I calculate your IQ score. I measure your left pinky toe. How long is it there? That's your IQ. It would be extremely reliable, very reliable test. Unless you have some terrible accident, your IQ score is going to be the same every time I do the measurement. Obviously, garbage test, right? What it lacks is validity, measurement validity. Validity is, does the test measure what it's supposed to measure? Again, as I said, there will be another sense of the term validity later in the chapter, which has to do with, did you do your experiment in a valid way? But probably a more important sense of the term validity is this one. It's used throughout psychological research. Now, we're not going to go into detail about how to measure this. There are different ways to get at whether a test is really measuring what it's supposed to measure. I'll give one example. You will not be tested on this example, but it might just help you think about how this works. One way to get at whether a test is valid is to look at whether it predicts things that it should predict. So for example, in the case of IQ, good IQ tests are able to predict your grades. Now, not like all of it, like something like 25% of the variance, something like that. But it has some relationship with grades. People who have higher IQs on average crucially, get higher grades. And that's some indication that they're measuring something like intelligence. So you want something like that. You want some evidence that the test is not only reliable, meaning consistent, but it also has validity. It's measuring what it's supposed to measure. Any questions about the difference between those two? Yes, sir.
Can a test be both at the same time?
Oh, yes, it can be both. That's what we want. So like, the ideal is to have both, yes. You can be reliable without being valid. You can't really be valid without at least being a little bit reliable. Was it already 10:50?